Welcome to the Activism is Medicine Roundtable. My name is Frank Ferencic, and today I'd like to welcome you to a conversation with Alessandro Pelizzon. Alex is a legal scholar working in the domains of wild law, rights of nature, ecocide law, and the role of the modern university in the climate crisis. I hope you enjoy. Wonderful. Yes. So, Alex, I thought that we could hit a few of our favorite themes today and maybe start with a little bit of history of your journey to get to this point, and then dive into wild law, ecocide law, rights of nature, those kind of things. And all of us, we're really curious about your opinions on the role of the university in the modern climate crisis, that sort of thing. So maybe some history to start, and then we can branch off from there.
Sure. So, well, as the accent gives it away, I wasn't born here in Australia. I was actually born and raised in Italy, and raised and schooled in Italy. And so I moved to Australia as an exchange student when I was 16, and I really fell in love with country, capital C country, which is an Aboriginal term to refer to the interconnectedness of all beings. I fell in love with that when I was here at 16. And then, various vicissitudes, went back to Italy, also started a degree in law. And the Italian degree in law at the time was a 6 years degree. So it was a combined LLB, LLM effectively. And at the end of the fourth year, I actually got selected to get into one of the most prestigious, well, there are 5 prestigious theater schools in Italy. And so I became an actor for a few years. And so I lived 2 parallel lives, both as a law scholar, law student, and as an actor. And in parallel, I started working, supporting the drafting of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So my interest has always been in comparative law and legal anthropology. And so I attended a number of gatherings in Geneva. They used to be in July. And we organized a few events in Turin to sort of support or sensitize the Italian population actually to the issue. Obviously, there are no indigenous peoples as such or identified as such in Italy. The reason being that Italy has been this melting pot of cultures, peoples, realities for so long that it's impossible to identify indigeneity as such. There's definitely cultural identity in different regions, of course. And then at 30, I moved to Australia, and the entire family moved to Australia, actually. And I stumbled upon a PhD there because by then I had finished my LLB, LLM in Italy with a field research thesis in comparative law and legal anthropology on pre-Columbian family law in the Andes. So my interest was looking at the way in which traditional principles of family law remained primarily in the Peruvian Andes. And then when I came to Australia, I wanted to continue in the field. I wanted to continue to work with Indigenous rights and Indigenous law. And I had a civil law scholar's perspective. I imagine actually both of you have, because if you're from New York and you're from California, you both have a common law system. I think it's only Florida that has a dual system, isn't it? That has a little bit of civil law as a system, if I'm correct, in the US. So there was a different perspective as a codified civil lawyer versus a common lawyer in coming to Australia. And at the time, the idea of native title had just been around for a decade or so. And so I started talking to a professor here, and I said, well, but how can you speak of native title that are rooted in traditional interests in land and have no way of conceptualizing what traditional interests in land are? Because if you think of traditional interests in land in the way that the colonial Western legal system would think of them, then you're not really recognizing native title. You're imposing a particular set of worldviews or a particular worldview upon that which you apparently recognize. And at the time, this perspective was kind of novel, not any longer, of course. But the professor said, oh, that's really interesting. Do you want to do a PhD on that? And I enthusiastically said, yeah, what is it? I didn't really know what I was falling into. And so I started my PhD and did my PhD on native title and legal pluralism in Wollongong, which is just south of Sydney. And I was looking at the way in which there's a constant narrative of not any longer of the death of culture here in Australia, but there was a narrative of the death, sorry, not of the death of people, but there was a narrative of the death of culture. So that Aboriginal people who have been living in urban or semi-urban areas for a century or two, so the argument goes, have lost their traditional culture because they don't speak language anymore. And while some elements are true of this, it is also true that culture is a little bit more subtle in Aboriginal, among Aboriginal people. And it's contained and carried through stories. And stories are carried through the continuous kinship system. And so I wanted to show that the stories were still there, showing that the traditional interests in land were still very much alive. And so that was my PhD. Then in 2009, I stumbled upon, or I discovered the emergence of wild law and earth jurisprudence. You know, at the time, Ecuador had just passed the law a year prior. There was the first Australian conference on the topic. And then I continued, I fell in love with that because I thought, you know, wild law, earth jurisprudence, or what I now call ecological jurisprudence, is to law, I thought, what theoretical physics is to physics. It's the boundary, it's the frontier of law, because it forces us lawyers to think about questions about normativity. What is agency in law? We generally, you know, as lawyers, we think that agency is always attributed and attributable only to humans and by extension to human construct, but still through humans. But what if nature itself or natural elements themselves are agentic elements of law? Not just, you know, not just in a Latourian sense, not just as actant because they act upon the legal system, but as actual agent. What if an island can tell what the law is? And, you know, this is obviously what Aboriginal people here have been saying for tens of millennia. You know, the law comes from the land itself, or country, as they call it. So then I started mapping this terrain, and I've been doing that for the last 15 years. And I was one of the co-founders of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. I'm still involved in that. So that's kind of my background. Of late, probably over the last year or so, I've been fed up a little bit, like I think the three of you. I've been fed up with just talking about things. I want to do something that changes things. You know, I think it's important to talk. I think it's important to raise awareness and clarify issues. But there's a bit of an echoic chamber in universities. People just talk about things. Yeah, what do we do then? So I've been starting to think about how to transform that into practice. So one project that I have in mind, and we can talk about that. Sorry, I'm taking a long time to go around this. But one thing that I'd love to chat with you about is a project that I call an ecosophical neighborhood. So a way of putting together all these ideas, not in a confrontational manner, because of course, you know, we have to stand up against and in favor of certain regulations and regulatory regimes that need to change, of course. But at the same time, we shouldn't live our lives in conflict. It's like you've been saying for years, Frank, like, you know, change yourself to change the world. And I think change the way in which we live on a day-to-day basis and help each other to change that, you know, through our architecture, our energy consumption, our use of objects and so on. So that's the main project that I have at the moment.
Nice. Well, one question that has come up for us, because we're, you might say, possessed with the urgency of the moment and the speed and pace that needs to happen right now. And that's our question about the criminal law. Well, the law itself it takes a long time to change a legal system. And do we have that kind of time? Is there a way to move forward quickly on any of these things?
It's a good point, because I was talking about that with a colleague, Nikki Rogers, about that, and about the sense of urgency that we have. Maybe in a Taoist sense, if we look at it, you know, in a Taoist sense, time is also a construct. So urgency is something that we construct for ourselves. And because we're constantly adapting to that, which, we live in a constant state of flux and change. And now that might seem a banality, because of course there are speeds of change that are quite different. What we're experiencing now is completely different from what our forefathers experienced 100 years ago. But experience is subjective, and so we decide whether to experience it as urgency or not. In a way, it doesn't matter how fast things change, right? So it's still up to us to determine how we react to that which happens around us. So one thing that I'm becoming more and more enamored with, not necessarily good at or have even approached mastery of, is patience. And that's almost counterintuitive, but I think patience, and that's what all the elders I'm speaking to, they all reinforce the importance of patience and the long-term view of things. Doesn't matter how rapid change has been cast upon them, they all seem to say, well, patience is still the key, because if you're patient, you then watch things and then react to things thoughtfully rather than just reacting, quickly. So that's sort of a premise. That's the ontological or philosophical premise behind it. So patience and that Taoist adaptation to that which happens to us, I think, is what sort of ruling or sort of guiding my my current approach to things. In saying that, of course, the speed of what I think it's John Michael Greer that calls it the environmental predicament rather than the environmental crisis or the environmental problem. I don't know if you've encountered his work before.
Sounds very familiar. I'm not sure I know the name, but yes.
He's a really interesting historian. He also claims, like, he has embraced druidism, but in a very modern and philosophically deep way. So not in a sort of shallow, simplistic way, but really thinking about the symbolism of it all. And he says, well, a problem is something to which there is a solution. So once you have a problem, you find the solution and you revert back to the status quo. And so, whereas a predicament is something that you can never get, you can never really fix. You can only respond to and adapt to. So, fixing, you have a broken tire, you change the tire, you have a solution, you fix it, you go back to riding or driving. You age, well, you can't fix it. You just adapt to the process of aging. And he says, well, what we're experiencing today, it's an environmental predicament, not an environmental problem, because we can't fix it. We can only adapt to these changes. And they, as you were saying, like Frank, they super fast. And they're going faster and faster. Like I was looking at the numbers of the amount of land that we as a collective humans use for animal farming, the amount of the percentage of animals, of wild animals wild animal biomass on the planet. Like the numbers are staggering.
Yeah.
And the speed at which the glaciers are melting, of course, this is incredibly fast. But I still think we need to respond fast, but not necessarily with urgency, if it makes any sense. Mm-hmm. Like, it's almost like we have to respond fast, but with patience, if possible, in a way. In that patience is the attitude, fast is how we respond to things, in a way. And I'm quite impressed, because the last year we did a project with the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, mapping the number of initiatives that have been passed by different jurisdictions around the planet on ecological jurisprudence. And so that this includes rights of nature legislation provisions, constitution provisions, etc., ecocide, and environmental crime provisions of different nature. So that ecological civilization ideas and principles, and so on and so forth. So we mapped all of them, and we found that there was two, if we count the Makwa Borough and the Seldif initiatives in the US in 2008. So one or two. There were last year, so exactly a year ago, there were 460 over 42 jurisdictions plus the international level. That, to me, that's like, you know, in legal terms, this is incredibly fast. And there are no proposals. So we're not talking about ideas of changing legislation, ideas of changing the constitution. So we didn't count, for example, the failed Chilean change. So Chile wanted to change the constitution and includes rights of nature in the constitution, but that failed. So we didn't count that. We only counted successful proposals, successful initiatives. 460 odd in what, 15 years, 14 years. To me, that was mind-blowing. So I think that there's a huge collective response or desire for collective responses to that. But then I go back to the other problem that, you know, what the other thing is that we have this, you know, need for collective change because there's no way we can change things individually. But at the same time, there's a disconnect between, you know, these collective responses and what we do on a daily basis, because the political, social, and economic mechanisms that we inhabit force us to live in a certain way. Like, it doesn't, like, I imagine like the four of us want to be like this almost Spartan warriors, where we, like, not warriors as in terms of fighters, but as in terms of mental warriors, where we try to control ourselves, our spending, our consumption, etc. But we're still part of a system that forces us to operate in a certain way. And so I think an important point is this disconnect between the two. There is change and it's happening quite fast, but I think at an individual level, we don't really have alternatives. So we talk about rights of nature, but it's almost like a way of stopping the waves of, you know, neoliberalism, consumption, capitalism, or aggressive capitalism, and so on. But what do we do that is positive as an alternative? And I think that is less of a normative or a global normative idea and more of an individual opportunity. What spaces do we create that make people want to live differently? And, you know, I think actually, obviously, the four of us know it. Once you spend, I don't know, a week in nature away from the chaos of a metropolis, the biorhythms change, the circadian rhythms change, the way we listen, the way, you know, obviously I'm telling you things that you all know better than me, but I think actually that's the disconnect that really interests me. The fact that we're having like a faster and faster desire for change. Like, the Pope just virtually spoke of rights of nature without saying the word rights of nature, but he kind of did just now. And so it's really like the desire is there, and yet we're consuming ever more.
You know, I imagine you're familiar with some of the work of Jim Bendell.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, and you know, it seems to me that Bendell speaks of societies or the existing system collapsing because the fact that what we're consuming and the way the economy works is more than the planet can bear. So regardless of what is done, there's going to be some level of collapse. And what about the thought that these issues, such as the rights of nature, are going to have a much better chance of becoming law and being taken seriously given the collapse, because people aren't going to have a choice at that point. In other words, the time frame we're looking at now assumes that the existing system will continue. But if it doesn't, you know, it would seem to be the opportune time for other issues to assume importance, and how we can survive during a collapse without changing the law of nature, you know, is questionable. Have you ever considered that intersection? Collapse and the change of the law.
It's a good angle, and I'd say even more than survive is how do we thrive in that period. Because I think we need to do more than simply surviving. We need to create a framework of thriving even in that changing period. Because if we think of just surviving, we think that we're surviving a difficult period and then we go back to a sort of an idyllic state in a way. Not that you're suggesting that, but survive kind of suggests a transitional space. Whereas I think if we think of thriving in adaptation rather than surviving through collapse, then maybe reframe the idea. And so I started thinking about this many years ago, long before I even started university. Well, no, long before I started working on rights of nature or ecological jurisprudence. Because I always thought about, I don't know if you've read Asimov's saga, Isaac Asimov saga. So, the robots first, and you get the Galactic Empire, and then the empire collapses.
Right.
And the prescience, I think, of Asimov is that he realized that, well, through the symbol of Harry Sheldon in psychohistory, he realizes that the collapse is inevitable. So there's something that will sort of crumble upon itself. And the choice there is either 1,000,000 years of suffering or setting in places things that minimize suffering to, I think it's 1,000 years or something like that. And then thriving happens again. And in the interim, those spaces thrive. They don't just simply maintain the beacon of life in a way. And he calls that the foundation, or actually calls them the foundations, because there were more than one.
Right.
And ever since then, I started thinking, well, we should think of what's the foundation that we can think of so that we adapt to change. So that's sort of a premise that I've been working on for a long time, which assumes that the status quo, the political and economic and consumeristic status quo, is not sustainable over time, because like it's mathematically unsustainable. Like that's a given. Like, all right, but then I thought, okay, but what does that look like? And I don't remember who was talking of catabolic collapse. So rather than collapse as a single event, it's catabolic collapse is seen as the micro changes in the structure of political power, of interactions, of consumptions, etc., that we see operating already. Like we see that operating, for example, in the civil war in Syria, in a lot of sort of the unrest now in the Middle East, which I believe is connected to an extent to resources, obviously, water scarcity, and so on. It might not be portrayed as such, but there's definitely that's a major driver in one of the driest parts of the planet. We know that everything in the equatorial area will suffer the impact of rapid climate change far more than people living in subequatorial areas or temperate areas. And so then collapse is not just a single event. It's a combination of events that happen in different ways. And so there will be, depletion of resources here, which will lead to some corporation trying to get those resources, military efforts to control those resources, some wars in certain areas, some rationing, and maybe some other things happening in other areas. There will be in some areas what some call environmental fascism. There will be other experiments. So I don't think, unfortunately, I think the biggest problem that we have on the planet are nation states today. The fact that we have 200 nation states, each with independent claims to sovereignty, and spending trillions of dollars of trying to fight each other, when all that money could be actually spent to collectively solve the problems that we have. So nation states are clearly an obstacle to tackling things collectively. So I think that the collapse that you're speaking of, John, is happening. We see it happening now.
Yes.
But we see it happening in different forms in different parts. So I think rights of nature are one, if you want to, the Roman legal tradition response to this collapse, saying, well, we need to personify in a legal sense that which has just been commodified so far, natural assets and natural resources, etc., because then it gives legal agency to that.
Well, essentially, it's a personhood argument.
I think actually the rights and personhood are intertwined, because you can't have rights without having a subject of rights.
Right.
And a subject, another term for subject is person. So it's just the two are inseparable, obviously.
It's interesting. In the United States, there's a Supreme Court case. I think it's Morton versus Sierra Club.
Yeah.
Where Justice Douglas has a great dissent, but it's in the United States, we very quickly gave corporations personhood, but we won't give it to nature.
Right.
Yeah.
And that to me sort of says a lot about the underlying foundation of the law in the United States.
Yeah.
Well, and also corporations are a fiction created by the existing structure, whereas the nature lies outside the existing structure, except as a subject to it.
Yeah.
But then again, I have to say that the US have been, for the past 300 years, this very interesting crucible of legal experiments. Because it has to be admitted that apart from the legal codification, which is actually a French creation, the idea of a written constitution, the idea of a Bill of Rights, the idea of corporate personhood, the idea of nature's rights, they're all things that the US have really tackled. So there are these extremes in this experiment. So you really have on the one hand you have Trump, and on the other hand you have Ecotopia, and you really, like, the US are really this crucible for these extreme experiments. Some of them I'd rather not to exist, but unfortunately they're part of the crucible.
Yeah.
But it's so I think I also think that there's a portion of the US that is really thinking that as a possibility. And also it has the advantage, I think, a relatively unique advantage of tribal law. The way in which tribal law is codified in the US Constitution, and there's some element of domestic sovereignty or domestic dependent sovereignty in the US Constitution, means that some elements of rights of law can be codified through tribal law. And there have been, the Ponca Nation, the Klamath River, there are various councils that are considering the Manumin with the Chippewa Nation. So there are all these experiments that use traditional culture and traditional ways of thinking as nature as agentic, because for an indigenous person, we know that nature is an agent. Like, the idea that nature has rights, if couched in those terms, is self-evident. And that Chief Oral Alliance, I don't know if you remember when Chief Oral Alliance went to the UN, he was invited to speak to the UN. And he said there, and he opened up the speech by saying, well, you invite me here to talk to this gathering of all nations. But there's no seat here for the nation of the buffalo. There's no seat here for the nation of the eagle. There's no seat here for all the things that grow, that crawl, that swim, and that fly. And so to them, the idea that nature is agentic, as in a legal sense, is clear. But what I find interesting is that tribal legislation is now using the language of rights of nature, which is obviously, the idea of rights, the idea of the way in which it is conceived, obviously comes from the Roman legal tradition, civil and common law. But they're using that to codify and to convey traditional ways of seeing the world. And so the mainstream and the state-based courts are not yet speaking of natural personhood, but tribal law in the US is. And because of the unique space that tribal law has in the US, which is quite distinct from Canada, Australia, and other parts of the world, it means that that's another experiment that is happening in the US. So what started with CELDIF and kind of failed because of the two people who led CELDIF for a long period of time, what started there has been taken up by a number of tribes and transformed. And so the US is kind of leading in that tribal discourse around rights of nature. And so going back to what you were saying, John, I think these are all the various experiments that say that there's rights of nature are almost like a way in which the Western legal tradition is re-embracing ways of seeing the world that predate the crude anthropocentrism of the last couple of millennia. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I'm always curious about tactics and how to change public opinion. And here in the US, we talk about the Overton window, right? You're familiar with that, the range of acceptable discourse. And my fear is that things like wild law, rights of nature, bioregionalism, all of these things fall so far outside the Overton window, at least in popular culture, at least in the US, that people don't even talk about them. I mean, how do we change the dimensions of the Overton window to include these ideas?
I actually think it has changed, because I've seen it. Like I remember talking about the things that we are talking about now 15 years ago. And I remember very few people ever conceived of even the term of rights of nature. Like, it's what you were saying before, John, like, that it was alien, the idea that nature could be personified in a legal sense. And I remember a lot of colleagues as well, like even legal colleagues, saying, well, how is that possible? How can you actually consider nature, this is just a fantasy, it can never happen. Now, because it has happened in 460 instances, they can't say it can never happen, because it's literally denying the facts. So now they're saying, well, how does it work? So already they're shifting from can it happen to how does it happen?
Right.
So there's been already like a radical shift. And admittedly not necessarily the Murdoch press, but certainly, the Guardian, like there are so many newspapers, newsletters that do speak of nature's rights, etc. Here in Australia, like a few years ago, there was legislation passed. It's called the Yarra River Birrarung Protection Act. And the Yarra River is the river that runs through Melbourne. And the legislation fell short of giving personhood to the river, but it described the river as a living, integrated entity. And that was designed to shift the mindset. It wasn't designed to give personhood. It was designed to do what you were saying, like to really shift the mindset of people. So just extend the Overton window rather than pass legislation that does that. And it did have an effect, because they did this not experiment, but this thing where they asked primary school kids to do things like arts and poetry, etc., in relation to the river. And they were taught about the river, the Yarra River, as a living entity, etc. And these kids, non-Indigenous kids, so these just Melbourneian kids, various descent, they started saying, oh, but they started having different things, paintings and things. And when asked, well, why did you come up with this idea? Many of them said, oh, the river told me this. Like they started thinking of the river as, that ontological agent, that the entity that told them things. And that, 15 years ago, there's no way that would have been considered acceptable. So I think you're right. Like there's still a lot that needs to be done, but it's not a fringe movement. The idea that that we are interconnected with nature. So you think about this, like the climate skepticism. Have you seen that? Have you read that book, Merchant of Doubts?
Oh,
yeah. So Merchant of Doubts mapped really well the way in which climate skepticism was manufactured.
Right.
And over, I don't know, like 20, 25 years, 20, 30 years. But if you look at that now, you don't really have anyone, even in Murdoch media, that really genuinely say the climate is not changing. Like there's like, if they do, they looked upon as
they lose credibility. They have no credibility.
Yeah, they lose credibility.
They just come up with all these different ideas about it. Let me throw this out there as well, because you're reminding me that part of the impact, the unexpected, unintended consequences of the Endangered Species Act in America was that you didn't have to just take, the particular bird into account, but suddenly all the assessments had to take in whatever it took for the bird to survive. So you went from a singular item of that bird, we're trying to save that bird, to the bird and its habitat, and then the pieces of the habitat that all relate. And it seems to me it's not that big a shift from recognizing that the bird is connected to its habitat and its habitat's required for it to live, to we are connected to all the habitats. We need them to live, and so that there becomes a human justification for wanting to have these laws be recognized, for wanting to expand the concept of rights, and for wanting to see ourselves as co-equal partners in the creation that we live in.
And you just reminded me of something, or made me think about something, and that's kind of a jumping point, because absolutely that transition already forces us to think in an interconnected manner. But also what's happening now is that, so here in Australia, for example, many eucalyptus trees are protected because they are necessary for the koala survival, and koalas are an endangered species, so you need to protect some eucalyptus trees in order to protect koalas. But what's happening is that a lot of people here, well, in the region where I have my house, are planting eucalyptus trees so that they actually provide habitats for koalas. Problem is that area is a rainforesty area where eucalyptus are not necessarily native. They're native to Australia, but not to that area. And so the eucalyptus trees are now altering the traditional ecosystem in the area. And so that's adding a layer of complexity, because we have one idea of ecological integrity, but we don't really look at what ecological integrity actually is. And so we kind of overimpose our idea still. And so the shift is not simply from the single species to the idea of interconnectedness, but it's from interconnectedness as manufactured to, again, that idea of patience, to interconnectedness, something in which we see ourselves not just as the creators of interconnectedness, but as part of that web, and where we should be very, very, very careful about changing anything. It's like that idea when you pull on a string, you actually find it hitched to everything else,
right?
Like the famous quote, right?
Nice. Yeah, what do you see happening in the law schools? Because I guess traditionally, conventionally, they've been really anthropocentric. Has there been a shift? Are they teaching rights of nature, ecocide law, any of this in law schools now?
Definitely here in Australia.
Really?
I don't know enough to say about other jurisdictions, but definitely this is happening here in Australia. I've got so many students who want to do their honors work on this, and they do honors work on this, but not just with me. Now it's spreading everywhere. Like I get people contacting me saying, "Oh, can you actually review this thesis, or can you do this?" And so there are so many law schools that are now considering this very, very seriously. And as you said, I think law is becoming like a vehicle for cultural change, rather than. I think the greatest impact is less about the specifics of that particular legislation, whether that river then is a legal person or not, and it's more about the mindset that we have towards things. And people who wouldn't have thought twice about stomping over a snake or a cane toad or something, an animal, now they do. They say, well, actually that's, or even a tree, and now they think actually that tree is a living being, and it thinks differently. And maybe my hope is that one day that will extend beyond what we think as alive. We think of as animals and plants, maybe fungi, maybe bacteria as alive. But to a lot of cultures, rocks are alive, and I believe that rocks have, if you want to, a spirit. Like when I was in the Andes 6 years ago, we crossed a little mountain pass to go from Lima to the Amazons where I was staying. And when we crossed, the top of the mountains of those areas was completely blown away, because they're blowing it away to create open-air uranium mines. So they destroy the top of the Andes and just create uranium mines, open pit uranium mines. And it really felt as if there was, like, hard to describe it as anything other than an energy, but there was an energy that was suffering. Right? And the people, they say, well, they call them the apus, the spirits of the mountains, but they are the mountains themselves. And they said they're killing the uppers. And I thought about that then. And I thought, well, if rocks are living beings, and some rocks have been here for 800 million years, so the oldest entities you can think of, well, then they can die too. You can kill them. You can destroy them. And so maybe, this is obviously fringe thinking, of course, but maybe people are now thinking, well, trees are living beings. We shouldn't just cut down a tree because we're killing a tree. Not everybody's thinking that, of course, but some people are, more than 20 or 30 years ago. Maybe in 20 years' time, there will be more people thinking about rocks, etc. But I also think, yeah, and thinking like that. But also to go back to what you were saying, John, about the pending changes and the pending collapse. Maybe it's less about changing everybody's view and more about creating little hubs where this becomes a lived experience, and not hubs that are secluded, not that they close to the world. They open to the world, but they're strong in their belief. And there's a network of us believing and discussing similar things and finding ways to constantly adapt to this change, both positively and patiently, without necessarily thinking, well, Donald Trump has to think this, because he never will. And anyone who is of that mindset, and to be honest, who cares? It doesn't have to. We don't need, in a way, we don't need him to think that for us to live healthily.
Right.
Nice.
It seems to me that there's a developmental aspect to this, right? Native indigenous peoples in their pre-contact environment, if you will, had a radically different relationship to all of life, to living things. They were a seamless part of all, right? And then when we develop mythology and other things, we start to do things to screw with the predictability of the seasons and saving food, things like this. We take ourselves and separate ourselves from nature. Now we're trying to dominate it. And you eventually see the rise of religion showing man as dominant, right? The mythology of man as separate from and dominant over nature. And it seems like there's almost the way children develop, there's a developmental aspect here of reclaiming that innocence, reclaiming that originality, reclaiming that sense of a connected self, right? I mean, a lot of the malaise of the psychology of the modern world is disconnection and loneliness. It's like, how can you be lonely? You know, sister tree, father sky, you know, I mean, it's like, it's all right here. You've never left it. It's we're swimming in all of it already. We just have our third eye, if you will, closed, our spiritual, emotional, psychological eyes closed to it, right? So maybe there's a sense of reclaiming, maybe ecocide and other rights of nature and rights of all of life move forward faster if we can begin to reclaim within each of us that connection.
I agree. And I'd even say, because when we talk about the innocence of pre-colonial indigenous people, there's almost like innocence is often synonym with naivety to an extent.
Yeah.
Whereas I think it's the opposite.
Right.
Like the naivety is what has been concocted and created by that which you perfectly described. We are the naive ones. So it's almost as if we have to reclaim or to relearn the wisdom of people who are, they're not the innocent as in naive ones, we are.
Right.
And in a way, it's our job to become aware of that, because that's one thing I've learned here in Australia with a lot of the elders that I worked with. The depth of wisdom, and I'm sure that it's similar in the US with your colleagues, with Native people that you work with, the depth of wisdom of things that are apparently simple, like calling Father Sky and Mother Earth, is not just a fancy thing. It's not simplistic. It's a simple and yet incredibly complex way of depicting relationships between different natural elements that are intuitively understood at an emotional level, because I understand the relationship between a father and mother. And so there's a depth to that, and knowing exactly which is related to which. But I think that would have been probably the same, probably is the same, is the same if you look at the myths of the Greek myths, the relationship between Uranus and Gaia, the relationship between Zeus and Poseidon, the sky and the sea being brothers, the relationship between Zeus being the representation of the rain, and therefore the fertilizing capacity that gives birth to things. So Zeus has this promiscuous god. It's not a promiscuous god. It's a fertilizing god. That's why Zeus has all these women and all these demigods. So that there's a wisdom that has been forgotten in a way in a lot of metaphysical traditions that we have in the world. And now we just call like, oh, that's a fancy mythology, but there's more to that. There's an ecological wisdom in that mythological description. I remember reading once about the calendar that the Romans, at least Republican Romans, had, which I thought was genius. So they had two things. They had the cycle, well, 3 cycles. They had the cycle of the solstices and equinoxes, which, it's one. They had the cycles of the moons. And so they had festivities connected to each of the moons or the moon phases. And then they had the cycle of the day. And the way they organized the day, I thought was genius, because they said the day was divided in 12 hours, horas, but every day was divided into 12 hours. And the day began at sunrise and ended at sunset, which meant that the actual length of each hour changed depending on the season. So it was a very short hour in winter and a very long hour in summer. And then they said, well, between ora prima for the beginning and ora sexta, so half away, which would have been marked by the zenith. So you just look at the sky, look at the zenith, and you know when it marks the change. That is the time for work or heavy work, which meant that they would have worked, I don't know, because obviously, in Italy, that would have been the chain. They would have worked 9-10 hours during summer, but very little during winter. So the circadian rhythms of the body would have been aligned to the rhythms of the day, the rhythms of the seasons, the rhythms of the moon. So all that wisdom, I think, has been forgotten by the creation of clocks in a way.
Yeah. I really like what you said about the separation of how we've kept the myth but forgotten what it means, in a sense. Right? The grounding of the myth, right? We just have the talisman of the myth, the symbolic, and back to don't worship the idol of the myth, understand the depth and the connection of the myth.
I like the way you put it. Yes.
Does do these changes in the law in any way involve humans? Protection for humans? One of the things we're looking at is the issue of climate genocide, generational genocide, where the conduct of corporations will be leading to the death of children. And is that an issue that can be approached through these traditional ways of analyzing the law?
It's a really interesting question, because so there are two answers that I would say come to mind straight away. One is that, of course, ecological jurisprudence includes the rights of humans, because we are part of the system.
Right.
And so human rights are just as part of the system as anything else. And I remember Auntie Anne Paulina from the Kimberley, she says that sometimes people come and say, oh, humans are just a pest. We need to get rid of humans for Earth to thrive. And she said, but that's not true. Because the thing is, just as Earth would be saddened by the loss of whales, Earth would be saddened by the loss of humans.
Right.
She would lose the rhythmic dancing on the ground. She would lose the songs that are sung in all parts of the earth by humans. There are so many things that humans bring to the world, and it's not our technology, it's our inventiveness, our creativity, but it's other things. After all, we are a species with a huge responsibility. We have the capacity to effectively stop another ice age. Like, we have the capacity, the potential to regulate the homeostatic state of the planet to such a way that we limit the fluctuation of ice ages that have occurred before the Holocene.
Right. Yeah.
You know, we do that through the control of carbon, how much carbon we emit. So we really are, in a way, what the ancient myths say, the caretakers of the earth. Because we have that capacity, we can determine how much carbon we have. We can determine whether we're going to have another ice age or not.
Right.
Obviously, our power is going to our head. So we're suffering from what the Greeks called hubris. Some of us believe that responsibility means absolute control. So it's what, Radha and Kabash, like the two terms used in the Bible, rather than control and dominate, they should be guardianship and stewardship. So
Right.
the two Hebrew terms have been translated differently, and they have been used by some to say, well, humans have domination and control over the rest of nature, but that's not what the terms meant at the beginning. It's more like they have the responsibility of stewardship, and so yes, human rights are absolutely essential to the discourse. But then there's the other problem in that within that hubris, human rights require equality, because it's not fair to speak of human rights for a portion of humanity and the other ones stuff them. So we have to assume equality of rights, right, for that to be just. Problem is that there's 8.2 billion of us, and so there's a little bit too many of us. So we need to also somehow design the system so that we decrease our numbers to a sustainable number, one that allows us to be responsible, because 10 of us are not capable of that responsibility. There's too few of us. 10 billion of us, not too many of us. So that balance is necessary. So I think actually these are the two premises of the discourse. When we bring it down to the specifics of climate genocide, climate displacement, intergenerational ecocide, and so on, well, then these tools, I think, help us to bring these issues to the fore. They help us to be aware of these issues. It's like, the Juliana case in the US really brought to the fore this kind of conversation. The Netherlands case, I don't remember the name of it, the one where the kids asked or the Amazon rainforest case in Colombia, the one with the Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court of Colombia recognized the Amazon as a legal person in order to protect the rights of future generations, of the 25 kids who asked for that, even though the kids hadn't asked for legal personhood for the Amazon. So I think this becomes proxies, in a way, to try and balance this, the problem of not overshooting and at the same time maintaining social justice. It's that, that donut that Kate Raworth designed in Donut Economics, the safe and just space for humanity to operate, so that we don't overshoot beyond the planetary boundaries or shortfall the social foundations. Don't know if that.
Yeah. And when you talk of those numbers, the other issue is that who's expending and using what.
Yes.
In other words, part of the problem is 20% of the numbers are using 80% of the resources or something like that, and that there has to be some equality and balance in that also.
Yeah, agree. It's so, but even fixing that, even if we can fix that inequality, and we should absolutely, right, I think 8 billion is still far too great. So we need to do both. We need to fix inequality and at the same time decrease the numbers.
Right. I'm just putting up the Pope's perspective. I want to make sure that gets recognized here. And
but I agree. Yeah.
Speaking of the Pope, were you involved at all with the decision to, what do they call it, repudiate the doctrine of discovery?
That was really interesting. That was a powerful powerful statement, and it's probably 200 years too late, because the doctrine of discovery has lost its theological foundation, so that it operates irrespective of the papal authority as it originated from. And so since Queen Elizabeth gave letter patents to John Cabot based on the doctrine of discovery, even though she was an Anglican ruler,
Right.
not a Catholic ruler. Since then, the doctrine of discovery lost its Catholic foundation. So it has become now a principle of international law. And so the fact that, the US planted the flag on the moon, it's an enactment of the ritual of discovery. The fact that Canada and Russia planted the flag on the seabed, it's the same enactment. So it's not no longer dependent on the Catholic approval for it to apply.
Right.
That notwithstanding, the symbolism of the Catholic Church to say, well, this is repudiated now, it really gives pause, or should give pause, to nation states to think, well, maybe the very idea of discovery, of the doctrine of discovery, ought to be reconsidered. This idea of conquering the planet, conquering unconquered territory, should be rethought of. And but that's again, that goes back to the changing of the mindset that we were speaking of, because it's the same thing. Like, have a look, Red Bull athletes, all the athletes that conquer the eight Himalayan peaks. Why do you have to conquer them? Why? It's the mindset that is problematic, right? So it might not be a military or a political discovery, but it's the doctrine of discovery of the mind. It's the doctrine of domination, the theory of domination that we have ingrained in us. So I think that the rejection of the repudial of the doctrine of discovery by the Pope has the capacity to see this change, to see this radical change in there. And I think actually people should be entitled to try and go up to 8,000 meters in the Himalayas, but with no technological support. Go on foot, good luck, and no rescue teams.
Right.
If you die, you die.
Right.
Good on you, good luck. If you survive, fantastic.
Nice. Well, one subject we haven't really touched on much yet is the role of the university in all this. Because from my point of view, and just doing a casual look at what universities are doing these days, I'm not seeing much leadership. I'm really not seeing. You go to a typical university website, and it's all business as usual. There's no crisis. There's no predicament. There's nothing. It's just, here's a bunch of courses and we're great. And that's it. So why are they not stepping up? And I agree. You have an opinion about that.
Well, I've been really involved in a battle for the nature of the university here in Australia over the last 4 years. For some reason, Australian universities have been at the forefront of the neoliberalization of the university. They've been corporatized. They only about profit. So they have to make a profit. They make immense profit of both on domestic and international students. Students are paying something akin to, something like $60,000 US dollars for a course. And I know that in the US, it's even more. So it's an insane amount of money. So they actually get in debt. They get a debt very early on in life. They become indentured as a result of that, which pushes people to study only vocational courses that then can be sort of expended for a career that gives that money, which then clogs the courses, because we have, for example, in Australia, the population is 24 million people. There are 40 universities. There's twice as many, the ratio is twice as many as that of Italy. Like, it's insane. It's stupid. And each university, it's not even the teaching is fine. It's that each university has this huge bureaucratic corporate structure, highly hierarchical, with the vice chancellor and the deputy vice chancellor and the pro vice chancellor and the assistant to the pro vice chancellor and the deputy vice chancellor of the deputy vice chancellor. To give you an idea, have a guess how much. So the way it works here is that universities are public. They're statutory entities created by the state. So we're a federal system. The states are responsible for the creation of the universities, not the federal system. The federal system has no capacity to legislate on education of any sort. So the states create universities as statutory bodies.
Right.
The councils are the governing bodies of these institutions.
Okay.
Now, herein lies the problem, because these councils, 30% of the members of councils of each council are elected by the council itself. Another 30%, say another half, are appointed by the relevant minister on advice by the chancellor, which means they're elected by the council itself. So 75% of people on council are elected by themselves.
Mm.
And they're not accountable to anyone. They cannot be dismissed. They cannot be held accountable in any possible way. And then they appoint a vice chancellor to run the university. Now, these 75% of people on council have no expertise in academia. Many of them don't even have a degree. They're all successful business people. There's a guy who funded Donut King in Australia, or ran Donut King in Australia, who was on the council of the previous universities. What the fuck does he know about academia, right?
Right.
So they appoint the vice chancellor to run a university. The vice chancellors run universities in this absolutely inane way, doing exactly what you were describing, Frank. So they just come up with business as usual, don't care. They just want to have the bottom line. Have a guess. This is just a little game that I do with all my friends and colleagues. Have a guess at how much a vice chancellor pays themselves, because they actually decide they pay scale together with the council in Australia on average. Have a guess.
$1 million.
Yeah, you're right. That's exactly it. Yeah. That's on average.
Wow.
And that is 26 times the pay of the lowest paid academic. 26 times. So it's not like 4 or 5 times as much, which is already a lot, but 26 times as much.
Wow.
So that is why universities are not any longer the place of learning, the place of look at what happened with COVID, Trump, and all this post-truth era that we're still sort of trying to get out of. Universities should be the beacons of knowledge. They should be the ones that say, well, this is true, this is not. They hold that.
Right.
They're not taking up that responsibility. They're just ignoring it and just becoming just vocational colleges where you learn trades effectively. You learn how to, to do a repetitive task. That's all they teach. They don't teach to you. They're afraid of teaching thinking, I think. So I think what needs to happen, and what is happening to an extent, is the emergence of alternative educational institutions that are designed differently. And there are some emerging worldwide. We are, myself and Monica and another few, Monica Gagliano, whom you know quite, Frank, right. and a few other people are trying to, and remember I was mentioning it to you, we're trying to create what we call the Ecosophical Institute. And it's a learning institution where we try to teach ecosophy in the way in which Ananias described it, according to the seasons. So we want to do this thing. So we're designing it and we're trying to launch it within the next 2 years around Byron Bay. And we want to do it around the seasons, because, it doesn't matter where you are. There are 4 astronomical seasons, 2 equinoxes, 2 solstices. And each season, we're going to teach 1 theoretical, 1 practical, and 1 ethical thing. So ecological economics, environmental ethics, and permaculture, for example. And then so that by the end of your master degree, you actually know how to survive, thrive, and potentially influence change as well. But you start with the idea that you can survive, thrive in that level of survival, what we were saying before, John, and at the same time trying to push for some change. But if that change doesn't occur, it doesn't matter, because you can revert back to that survival. And so, if there's enough trade that you can drink coffee that is imported from somewhere else, well, you drink coffee. But if not, you've got herbal drinks from the region that you are growing it. So that there's sort of a foundation where you're still happy and you're living fully. And then additional trades gives extra things. But rather than, anyone living in the city that if anything collapses here, I don't know what to do. We're going to eat each other. That's the only thing that we can think of. Yeah. So, which is why actually I really am happy with overweight people, because they're the first ones that will eat.
Well, there is that. I've heard people say that, it says like, well, if collapse comes, I'm 500, I'm 220 kilos, I'm going to be fine. I can outlast everybody else. Right. So, and there's some
You're the
truth
first
to
one that we eat.
that. There's some
You're
truth.
tender.
That's right.
Nice.
You steak. You who weigh 220 kilos, because you're not running fast, first of all.
No,
Somebody's
I'm
gonna
running
catch you.
right.
So you pray, you're not survival.
But there's something about that too, inside of what you've said, which is that people who have that permaculture, that sustainability, the ability to communicate, the understanding, the connections, the connectedness, those people who've built those communities will be much safer. They'll be much more sustainable. They'll be the arcs of, they'll be sort of like the Harry Seldon foundations, if you will, that can spread around to the communities outside of them that haven't taken that same path.
Exactly. That's my very idea. And on that foundation, then you can build everything else. You can learn AI, you can learn advanced medicine, you can learn anything else, but have that foundation. The rest is in addition to. It shouldn't be instead of that foundation. So I think universities are not taking up the responsibility of maintaining that foundations. They did so in the 1200, in the 1100, in that time. They did so, not any longer. And so I think, but also universities came up because of that needs. That need that some people had to learn meant that some people banded together and they started teaching each other. So students, so that's the meaning of university, Universitas Scholarum et Studentorum, the collective of the students and the scholars. That's what universities were at the beginning. So institutionalized universities are failing, but alternative universities, these things that we can think of, and it'd be nice to think of these collectively and really trying to find ways of, I think actually, people like us, building networks that sustain each other at an international level, that then they become alternative learning places where we're not there to make money. We're not there to make $1 million because none of us cares. But we're there to really guarantee that healthy, thriving, not just surviving of the arcs, as you said. Like I really like that.
Right. Well, the last time we got together, we were talking a little bit about this idea of servant leadership by the tribal elders, and that really feels like a powerful idea. It's like, no, we got to give back to people to help them survive and thrive, and that's kind of our identity now. That's our role. So.
And maybe we'll become farmers in the morning, scholars in the afternoon, and philosophers in the evening, or artists in the evening.
Yeah.
That is, and wasn't that the dream of that? Well, first of all, I think it was the dream of who was it? Claudius? One of the Roman emperors who actually dreamed of that exactly before Marcus Aurelius. I don't remember which one. Could be Claudius. I don't remember. And but also of Cato the Elder, who was like that Roman leader and philosopher who loved actually doing exactly that, being a farmer in the morning and a philosopher, not a scholar, but a philosopher in the evening. And then he was called upon, I don't remember if it was the Third Punic War, or which of the Punic Wars, called back, won the war, won all the, and people said, oh, you should actually remain in power and maintain the accolades. And he actually said, he refused any statue built to him because he said, you shouldn't celebrate me. You should celebrate the victory of Rome. And he went back to his farm to continue to be a farmer. And to me, that is one of the most inspiring stories, because he was a farmer in the morning, a philosopher in the evening. And when need arose, he became something else. But he didn't stay there. He went back to what he actually was. He had that sense of identity.
Right.
Like that.
Right.
Yeah.
The myth of George Washington says he did the same thing. Apparently didn't last in the White House long enough.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Meaning that after he was president, he was president, and then he said, "I'm going." They offered him to make him a king and keep him. He said, "No, I'm going to go back to my farm, back to my life."
I did not know that. Yeah. Interesting. Well, in a way, I think actually the foundational myth of the US, if preserved, is still a very powerful myth in that sense. Like the US was founded, and even if no, the true foundational myth of the US is founded on this sense of res publica, where there is no king, there is no ruler other than a servant to the others, and it's actually founded on interactions with the traditional communities, because Benjamin Franklin really copied the federal system for Dio de Nozione. It didn't come up with it, you know. It's an indigenous way of seeing the world, the federal system as conceived of by the US. Unfortunately, it has been perverted by a portion of the population that I don't think really reflects that myth, and really stuffed up the planet for a little while. But there is still an element in the foundational myth of the US that is quite the opposite of that. And it's what I think it's what captivated the world over. The reason that the world followed the US and not the Soviet model is that it really has that foundational myth at its core. The idea that, you know, that the res publica, it's that embodiment of the myth of Rome or the myth of Sparta before that. And it got lost, to be honest, but it's not lost forever, and it's not completely lost. So that there's still a beacon there, I think, in that myth.
Nice.
So thank you for sharing that. I didn't know about Washington.
Well, on that note, which is inspiring, we know you've got to move on and you've got other things to do. We'd love to talk to you all day, but you guys have any other questions or any other thoughts?
No, this has been very, very interesting for me. And I want to thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts. Oh,
my pleasure. And it's been really great. So Frank and I have known each other and worked together for a few years now, and I can't say how much I admire Frank's work ever. Like all the time I say this, but it's been absolutely a pleasure meeting the two of you as well. So I really hope actually we can continue to converse and cross paths and imagine things together, because I'd really hope that this network really emerges over time in a more stable manner. And that it creates, like, you know, the tendrils that become strong enough. Like Frank and I have already this bond, clearly, but I hope that this actually expands and stays, so that we have not just personal but also professional and institutional connections that can allow us to thrive in the future. So thank you.
Nice. Yes. Thank you so much. And we just look forward to staying in touch and participating to whatever level we can. And don't be shy about reaching out. And if you got any new stuff, we'll be happy to hear about it.
Absolutely.
With pleasure. With pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes.
All the best.
Thank you. We'll talk.
Thank you.
Bye.
Right. Bye.
And that's our conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you want more information about Activism is Medicine, go to activismismedicine.net, and we hope to see you next time.